The cattle barons of Wyoming labeled us rustlers and thieves. Then they hanged my friends Ellen Watson and Jim Averill without trial or mercy. They came for me next at my cabin on the KC Ranch. They thought I would die quietly. I decided that, if I was to meet my maker that day, I would introduce them to theirs first. This is how a simple rancher named Nate Champion became the man who exposed the greed and corruption of the powerful Wyoming Stock Growers Association to the entire nation. I first came to Johnson County, Wyoming Territory in the winter of 1885. The endless prairie stretched out under the big sky, a land where a man could breathe free if he was willing to work hard enough. I arrived with little more than the clothes on my back, my saddle, and a dream of carving out my own place in this wild country. The Powder River Basin had grass tall enough to touch a horse's belly in spring. Good cattle country. Back then, I worked as a hired hand for the bigger outfits. I was known as a top hand, reliable, good with cattle and horses. I could ride anything with hair and track a steer through country that would make most men turn back. The work was honest, but the pay was meager. Still, I saved every dollar I could toward my own spread. The big cattle companies owned this country in those days. The Wyoming Stock Growers Association was their weapon. Men like Frank Canton, W.C. Irvine, and Frank Wolcott controlled hundreds of thousands of acres. They had the politicians in their pockets and the newspaper editors at their beck and call. They built mansions in Cheyenne while men like me slept under the stars. In those early years, I became friends with Jim Averill and Ellen Watson. Most folks called her Cattle Kate, though she hated that name. Jim ran a small store and saloon along the Sweetwater. Ellen kept a boarding house nearby. They were good people, hard-working, fair. They married quietly, though they kept separate properties, due to homestead laws. I saved enough to stake my own claim by 1889, nothing fancy. A small cabin on the KC Ranch near KC. I ran a modest herd, maybe 100 head. My neighbors were men like me, small operators. We helped each other during roundups and branding. We shared work, meals, and dreams for the future. Nick Ray became my closest friend and partner on the ranch. He was younger than me, but had a good head on his shoulders. The winter of 1886 and 1887 changed everything in Wyoming. A devastating blizzard wiped out thousands of cattle. The big outfits lost fortunes. They had overstocked the range, and nature collected the debt. Instead of accepting their poor management, they looked for someone to blame. Their eyes turned to us, the small ranchers, the newcomers. Their accusation was simple and devastating, rustling. They claimed we were stealing their cattle to build, our herds. The truth was different. We were simply following the unwritten law of the range. Unbranded mavericks belonged to whoever found them first. That had always been the custom. But the association changed the rules to favor only themselves. I remember the day Jim told me about the threats. It was early summer 1889. We were sharing coffee outside his store. The sun was warm on our faces. Jim pushed his hat back and looked troubled. He said men from the association had warned him to sell out and leave. They accused him of changing brands. Ellen had received similar warnings. I assured him it would pass, that reasonable men would prevail. I was wrong. On July 17, 1889, they hanged Jim and Ellen. No trial, no jury, just the judgment of wealthy men who viewed us as vermin on their land. They claimed to have caught the couple red-handed with stolen cattle. The newspaper called it justice against thieves. I called it murder. I attended their burial at the small cemetery near the Sweetwater. Only a handful of us dared to show up. The association had sent a clear message. We were not welcome in Wyoming. I stood at those fresh graves and something hardened inside me. I would not be driven off my land. I would not abandon what I had built with my own two hands. If they wanted a fight, I would give them one. The murders of Jim and Ellen cast a shadow over Johnson County. Fear settled on the small ranchers like early frost. Some sold out for pennies on the dollar and left. Others stayed but kept their heads down. A few of us began to organize. We formed the Northern Wyoming Farmers and Stock Growers Association. Our answer to their power, our voices united. The big outfits controlled the roundups. They claimed any unbranded calves following their cows. When we tried to participate, their foremen turned us away at gunpoint. Their cowboys cut our cattle out of the herds. Our complaints to the territorial authorities went unanswered. The law wore the brand of the association. In town, merchants were pressured not to sell to us. Credit dried up at the banks. The Buffalo Bulletin was the only newspaper that dared to print our side of the story. Its editor, Red Angus, became a voice for the small ranchers. The association labeled him a troublemaker and threatened to destroy his business. I began to notice riders watching my place from the ridgelines. Cattle disappeared from my pastures. Fences were cut. A fire mysteriously started in my hay storage but was extinguished by a timely rainstorm. These were not random acts. This was a campaign to break us. Frank Canton was the worst of them, a former Johnson County sheriff now working as the association's enforcer. He had been a bank robber named Joe Horner before reinventing himself as a lawman. Now he used his badge and gun to intimidate honest men. I crossed paths with him in Buffalo one afternoon in the spring of 1890. I was leaving the general store when Canton and two of his men blocked my path. The street cleared quickly. No one wanted to witness what might happen. Canton told me that rustlers had short lives in Wyoming. I informed him that honest men had nothing to fear. He laughed and said the association had already determined I was not an honest man. I kept my hand near my sidearm as I walked past them. The confrontation ended there, but the threat remained. In November 1891, a man named George Henderson was found shot dead near my property. The association immediately claimed he had caught me stealing cattle. They demanded my arrest. The only evidence was Henderson's body and their accusations. Sheriff Red Angus refused to arrest me without proof. The association was furious. They increased their patrols around Johnson County. Winter came early that year, heavy snow and bitter cold. Nick Ray and I spent most days feeding cattle and repairing equipment. On the rare trips to town, we heard rumors. The association was hiring gunmen from Texas. They were preparing for something big. We discussed it with other small ranchers. Some wanted to leave before the storm broke. Others suggested we arm ourselves and prepare. I believed in standing our ground. This was our home now. In February 1892, I attended a meeting of small ranchers at a farm outside Buffalo. There were perhaps 30 men present. Some I knew well. Others were just faces without names. We discussed our options. A man named Jack Flagg suggested we form our own protection society. Each ranch would send riders if another was threatened. It was not a perfect plan, but it gave us some security. As the winter began to break, we received word that the association had created a death list. 70 men in Johnson County were to be eliminated. My name was near the top of that list. They called us rustlers and anarchists. They claimed we threatened the very fabric of society. What we threatened was their monopoly on Wyoming grass and water. In March, I wrote a letter to the Buffalo Bulletin. I detailed the harassment we had endured, the false accusations, the economic pressure. I ended by stating that if violence came to Johnson County, it would not be started by the small ranchers, but we would certainly finish it. The association responded by calling me the King of the Rustlers, a dangerous criminal who should be removed from decent society. On April 2, 1892, Nick and I were working cattle near our cabin when a rider appeared. It was Jack Flagg with disturbing news. A special train had arrived in Casper the previous night. It carried 50 men, mostly Texas gunfighters, led by Frank Wolcott and Frank Canton. They were heading to Johnson County with a list of names and legal documents they called arrest warrants. We all knew arrests were not their true intention. Nick and I thanked Jack for the warning. We discussed our options as we rode back to the cabin. We could flee north to Montana. We could join the other small ranchers in Buffalo for protection. In the end, we decided to stay at our ranch. This was our home. We would not be driven from it without a fight. It was a decision that would cost Nick his life and forever change mine. The evening of April 8th was cold but clear. Nick and I ate a simple supper of beans and biscuits. We discussed plans for spring branding. 2 trappers named Ben Jones and Bill Walker asked if they could stay the night. We welcomed them to share our roof and food. 4 men in a small cabin on a vast Wyoming prairie. None of us knew that the association's killers were already closing in. I woke before dawn on April 9th to the sound of a gunshot. The cabin was instantly filled with the crack of rifle fire. Bullets splintered the door and windows. Nick jumped from his bed, reaching for his rifle. A bullet caught him in the chest before his feet hit the floor. He fell back with a surprised look on his face. Just like that, my friend was gone. Jones and Walker pressed themselves against the floor. They had no part in this fight but were caught in it nonetheless. I grabbed my Winchester and returned fire through the windows. Muzzle flashes revealed men surrounding our cabin. At least 20 of them. Maybe more. They had positioned themselves behind our woodpile, the stable, and an irrigation ditch. They had us completely surrounded. I dragged Nick to the far corner of the cabin, but it was too late. His eyes stared at nothing. I felt a cold rage replace the initial shock and fear. These men had come to murder us in our beds. They had killed Nick without warning or mercy. I swore that I would make them pay a heavy price for his life. The firing continued through the early morning. I moved between windows, taking careful shots when I saw movement. I heard cries of pain that told me some of my bullets found their marks. Jones and Walker remained on the floor, unarmed and terrified. I told them to stay down. This was not their fight. Around 9 in the morning, the shooting paused. A voice called out for us to surrender. They promised safe passage if we came out unarmed. I laughed bitterly at this. I had seen their idea of justice with Jim and Ellen. I had Nick's cooling body as evidence of their intentions. I shouted back that they were cowards and murderers, that real men did not hide behind false badges and hired guns. The siege continued. Through the morning, I rationed our ammunition. Each shot had to count. Around noon, I saw them preparing something new. They had constructed a movable barricade from a wagon. Behind it, a man approached with something burning. A fire arrow struck our roof but failed to catch. Their second attempt was more successful. Smoke began to fill the cabin. I knew then that my time was running short. I took a moment to write in my pocket journal. I needed someone to know what happened here. That we had not been rustlers or thieves. That we had only wanted what every American is promised, a chance to build something of our own. I wrote quickly as the smoke thickened. Jones and Walker were coughing violently now. I told them to make a run for the creek when I provided covering fire. They were reluctant to leave me but had no choice. I unleashed a barrage from my Winchester as they bolted through the back door. The invaders were focused on me and the 2 men escaped. At least there would be witnesses. The roof was fully engulfed now. Burning debris fell around me. The heat was becoming unbearable. Smoke filled my lungs with each breath. I had perhaps 24 cartridges left. Each one would find a target. I would not die easily or alone. I thought of my family back in Texas, of the letter I had started to my brother that sat unfinished on the table. I thought of Nick and the future we had planned for the ranch, of Jim and Ellen swinging from that cottonwood tree. All our dreams ending in violence because wealthy men decided we had no right to share in the prosperity of Wyoming. In that moment, as flames consumed my home and gunmen waited for me to burn or run, I made a decision. My death would have meaning. It would expose the corruption and violence of the cattle barons. It would rally the people of Johnson County against the association. My revenge would not be in how many of them I killed, but in how their actions would be judged by history. The cabin was becoming an inferno. I wet a bandana and tied it over my face. It provided little relief from the smoke. I gathered my remaining ammunition and my journal. I had written several pages detailing the attack and naming the men I recognized: Frank Canton, Frank Woolcott, W.C. Irvine, men who claimed to represent law and civilization while committing murder. I placed the journal inside my shirt next to my skin. If my body was recovered, perhaps the truth would be found. I checked my Winchester. 6 rounds remained in the magazine. My revolver held 5 cartridges, 11 chances to take association men with me to judgment. The back wall of the cabin was not yet fully engulfed. I could make a run for the creek about 50 yards away. The brush might provide some cover. It was a desperate plan, but my only option besides burning alive. I took several deep breaths through the wet cloth. I would need all my strength and speed. I crawled to the back window and peered out. 2 men were visible, guarding that approach. One was partially exposed from behind a large rock. The other stood more openly, perhaps believing no one could survive inside the burning structure. I aimed carefully at the exposed man first. My shot caught him in the chest. He crumpled without a sound. The second man ducked for cover, but not before my next bullet found his leg. He screamed in pain. The sound would alert the others that I was still fighting. I had perhaps 30 seconds before they repositioned to cut off my escape. I kicked out the remains of the window frame and dove through the opening. The fresh air was glorious despite the bullets that immediately sought me out. I rolled to my feet and ran in a zigzag pattern toward the creek. A bullet tugged at my sleeve. Another kicked up dirt at my feet. I did not slow down. I reached the creek bank and slid down into the shallow water. It provided minimal cover but was better than nothing. I could hear shouts behind me as the invaders organized a pursuit. I moved downstream, keeping low in the water. Each step took me further from my home but closer to potential safety. After perhaps a quarter mile, I found what I was looking for. A small drainage culvert cut into the bank. It was barely large enough for a man, but it would have to do. Crawled inside just as riders appeared along the creek. They fired randomly into the brush, unsure of my location. I remained motionless in the culvert as they searched. Hours passed. The sun began to set. My wet clothes chilled me to the bone, but I dared not move. Eventually, the search parties thinned. They believed I had either escaped or died in the creek from my wounds. Little did they know I was unharmed and watching their every move. As darkness fell, I allowed myself to consider my next steps. I needed to reach Buffalo, to warn the townspeople and other ranchers. The association's killing party would not stop with me. They had come to eliminate all resistance in Johnson County. If I could raise the alarm, perhaps others could be saved. Buffalo was nearly 40 miles away. On foot in my condition, it would take at least 2 days. I had no food and was already weakened from the siege. But I had something more powerful than physical strength. I had the truth of what these men had done. I had the names of the killers. I had the story that would expose the association to the world. I waited until full darkness before leaving my hiding place. The night was clear and cold. Stars spread across the Wyoming sky like diamonds on black velvet. I oriented myself using the North Star and began walking. Each step was an act of defiance against those who thought they had killed me. Each mile was a promise to Nick and all the others who had died. By dawn, I had covered perhaps 15 miles. I hid in a stand of cottonwoods during daylight. I chewed on roots and bark to quell my hunger. I added more details to my journal, names, descriptions, everything I could remember about the attack. This written testimony would be my most powerful weapon against the association. The second night, I continued my journey. My body ached with exhaustion, but my resolve never wavered. I reached the outskirts of Buffalo shortly after midnight on Tucumah, April 11th. I avoided the main roads, uncertain if association men might be watching. Instead, I made my way to the home of Red Angus, editor of the Buffalo Bulletin, and a man I knew I could trust. Angus was shocked to see me alive. The news of the attack on my cabin had already reached town. The association had announced that the notorious rustler Nate Champion had been killed while resisting arrest. They claimed it was a legal posse carrying out justice. Angus knew better. He helped me inside and called for a doctor. As the doctor tended to my minor wounds, I told Angus everything. The ambush, Nick's murder, the burning of our cabin, the journal I had kept throughout the ordeal. He took notes rapidly, his face growing darker with each detail. When I finished, he informed me that the association's men were now holed up at the TA Ranch south of Buffalo. The people of Johnson County had risen up against them. Hundreds of small ranchers, townspeople, and cowboys had formed a citizens' army to capture the invaders. For the first time since the attack, I smiled. My escape and testimony would be the final nail in the association's coffin. The revenge I sought would not come from my gun, but from justice. The truth would be my bullet, and it would strike true. I rested at Angus's home for several hours. The doctor insisted I was in no condition to join the fight at the TA Ranch. I reluctantly agreed to remain behind while Angus took my journal and testimony to Sheriff Red Angus and the Citizens' Army. Before he left, I dictated a statement that he promised to print in the next edition of the bulletin. By noon, word spread through Buffalo that I had survived. People came to Angus's home to see for themselves, to shake my hand, to express their outrage at what had been done. I was no longer just Nate Champion, small rancher. I was a symbol of resistance against the tyranny of wealth and power. Angus returned in the evening with news. My journal had been read aloud to the men surrounding the TA Ranch. Its contents had inflamed their determination to capture the invaders. The Citizens' Army now numbered over 400. They had the association's men completely surrounded. There would be no escape for the killers. I learned that the siege at the TA Ranch had become national news. Telegrams were arriving hourly at the Buffalo Telegraph office. Newspapers in Denver, Chicago, and New York were covering the story. They called it the Johnson County War. The tale of wealthy cattle barons hiring an army of killers to eliminate small ranchers had captured the attention of the entire country. My survival and testimony had transformed the narrative. The association could no longer claim they were enforcing the law against thieves. My journal provided proof of their true intentions: murder, elimination of competition, the theft of our land through violence and intimidation. The court of public opinion was turning against them with each passing hour. On April 12th, a cavalry detachment from Fort McKinney arrived at the TA Ranch. President Benjamin Harrison had ordered federal troops to intervene. The Citizens' Army reluctantly allowed the soldiers to take custody of the invaders. Franks, Wolcott, Frank Canton, and the Texas gunmen surrendered to the cavalry rather than face the justice of Johnson County. I was disappointed that they would not face immediate judgment from the people they had wronged. But I understood that this was now bigger than my personal desire for vengeance. This had become a national scandal that would be tried in the courts and the newspapers. My role was to ensure the truth was known. The following day, I was strong enough to visit the sheriff's office. I gave a formal statement about the attack on the KC Ranch. I identified as many of the attackers as I could. I described how Nick Ray had been murdered without warning or provocation, how they had burned our cabin to force us out, how they had planned to kill me without arrest or trial. Sheriff Angus informed me that my journal had already been copied and sent to newspapers across the country. The association had powerful friends in the territorial government, but even they could not suppress a story that had captured national attention. The invaders would face charges of murder and arson. Their wealthy backers would be exposed as the architects of violence. I visited the ruins of my cabin 2 days later. Nothing remained but ashes and charred timbers. Nick had been buried nearby by the Citizens' Army. I stood at his grave and promised that his death would not be forgotten, that the men responsible would pay a price, perhaps not with their lives, but with their reputations and freedom. The Buffalo Bulletin published a special edition on April 15th. My photograph appeared on the front page alongside my account of the siege. Angus wrote a powerful editorial condemning the association and demanding justice. Other newspapers across the country picked up the story. Harper's Weekly announced plans for an illustrated feature on the Johnson County War. The association fought back through their allies. The Cheyenne newspapers called me a thief and a liar. They claimed I had attacked innocent men carrying legal warrants. But their version of events found little support outside Wyoming. The image of wealthy cattlemen hiring Texas gunfighters to murder small ranchers was too powerful to overcome with propaganda. In May, I was called to Cheyenne to testify before a grand jury. The association had managed to have the case moved to their stronghold. Their lawyers and political allies worked tirelessly to discredit me and the other Johnson County witnesses. Despite clear evidence of murder and conspiracy, the jury declined to indict Frank Wolcott, Frank Canton, and the other invaders. I was not surprised by this outcome. The association owned the courts in Cheyenne just as they owned the newspapers and politicians. But they had lost something more valuable than a legal case. They had lost the trust and respect of the American people. The Johnson County War had exposed their methods and motives to national scrutiny. More importantly, they had lost their grip on Johnson County. Small ranchers were no longer intimidated. We organized, we voted, we defended our rights. The Northern Wyoming Farmers and Stock Growers Association grew stronger with each passing month. The reign of the cattle barons was ending. My greatest revenge came not from seeing my enemies in prison, but from watching their power crumble. From knowing that Nick, Jim, Ellen, and all the others had not died in vain. Their sacrifices had revealed the corruption at the heart of Wyoming's power structure, had shown Americans the true cost of allowing wealth to control justice. In October 1892, 6 months after the invasion, I stood for election as Johnson County Commissioner. The people who had once known me only as a quiet rancher now saw me as a leader, as someone who had faced the association's guns and lived to tell the tale. I won the election by a landslide. It was perhaps the sweetest victory of all. The man they had tried to eliminate as a rustler was now helping govern the county they had once controlled. It has been 3 years since the Johnson County War. I still ranch on the rebuilt KC Ranch, though I spend much of my time on county business. Now, the association never recovered from the scandal of the invasion. Their political power diminished with each passing year. Many of the cattle barons sold their holdings and returned east, unwilling to operate in a Wyoming they no longer controlled. Frank Canton fled to Oklahoma Territory, where he reinvented himself yet again as a lawman. Frank Wolcott retired to his ranch, a diminished figure who is shunned in many circles. The Texas gunfighters scattered to the winds, carrying the stain of their actions with them. None found welcome in Wyoming again. The small ranchers of Johnson County prospered in the aftermath of the war. Without the association's harassment, we built successful operations. We formed cooperatives for shipping cattle to market. We elected officials who represented our interests rather than those of distant corporations. We created the Wyoming we had always envisioned. A place where hard work and determination mattered more than wealth and connections. I think often of Nick Ray, of Jim Averill and Ellen Watson, of all those who died because they dared to claim their piece of the American dream. I visit their graves each spring when the prairie flowers bloom. I tell them about our victories, about the changes their sacrifices made possible. I hope they would be proud of what we built from the ashes of their deaths. My journal from the EI siege became something of a historical document. It was published in newspapers across the country. It was entered into the congressional record during debates about monopolies and corporate power. It helped shape new laws about land use and homesteading. Words written in desperation as my cabin burned around me helped change the nation's understanding of the true cost of unchecked wealth and power. The Johnson County War was the last gasp of the old Wyoming. The Wyoming controlled by Eastern money and corporate interests. The Wyoming where might made right and where ordinary men and women had no voice. From its ashes rose a new territory, soon to be state, where democracy meant something real, where the people determined their own fate. I never married. The events of April 1892 left scars that never fully healed. I sometimes wake in the night hearing gunfire, smelling smoke, seeing Nick fall. But I find comfort in knowing that I kept my promise. I exposed the truth about the association. I helped break their power over Wyoming. My revenge was not in killing my enemies, but in destroying what they valued most: their control, their impunity, their belief that their money placed them above the law and beyond judgment. This winter I will begin writing my memoirs. The full story of the Johnson County War and its aftermath. I want future generations to understand what happened here. How close Wyoming came to becoming a feudal state controlled by absentee landlords. How ordinary men and women stood against overwhelming power and prevailed. Not through violence, though, that was forced upon us, but through courage, solidarity, and an unwavering commitment to justice. They called us thieves and rustlers. They tried to erase us from the land we loved. They failed. Our names and our story will be remembered long after theirs are forgotten. That is a revenge sweeter than any bullet could deliver. That is a legacy, worth the price we paid. I am Nate Champion. I survived the Johnson County War. I helped build a better Wyoming. And I made sure the world knew the truth about the men who tried to kill me and steal our future. In the end, that was the most powerful revenge of all.